Madam President, once again today, in addition to the representative of the European Union, we can see a list of speakers and 5 European Union countries, Finland, Poland and Estonia. They're clearly going to make a sizable contribution to today's discussion. Only we believe that this is an impossible mission for them, as we have increasingly become convinced there is no added value that they can bring to the discussion. We're not seeing a long line of countries from the European Union rushing to sign up for the meetings on Ukraine that we organize. Madam President, we're increasingly convinced that in convening meetings such as today's one, our Western colleagues are pursuing a single aim: to artificially keep the subject of Ukraine afloat in the Security Council, and in so doing to demonstrate in public their support for the rapidly bankrupting anti-Russian project in Ukraine. If they really wanted to focus attention on the problems born out of the Ukraine crisis, their statements would be entirely different, and they would contain at least some truth about what is happening, rather than a worn-out set of accusations against Russia. And in actual fact, there are indeed a great many such problems. The main one of those problems, the ongoing feeding of the Kiev regime with weapons, hardware, mercenary and intelligence, is something we'll touch upon during a separate meeting on the 31st of October. It's hard to say what is a greater motivation for our Western colleagues here. Is it pure greed, because in the hostilities in Ukraine they are making billions of dollars, or is it a reluctance to admit their mistakes, including those committed back when they were only modeling the Ukraine crisis? Another block of problems can be summed up via the insightful statement by the Polish President Andrzej Duda, saying that Ukraine is a drowning person dragging down to the depths those that are trying to help it. And it's not even a question of Europe rapidly losing its economic and political heft and looking more and more like a lightweight. That's an internal European problem caused by the conscious, flawed choice of the European elites in favor of confrontation rather than cooperation with Russia. The problem is that the now expired Ukrainian president, who's clearly facing defeat on the battlefield, is now openly betting exclusively on dragging NATO into a direct rather than a proxy conflict with a nuclear power. And it is not balking at open blackmail in doing so. A clear example of this last week was Zelenskyy's unveiling of his latest pseudo-peace plan, the so-called victory plan, the essence of which is to push the West to enter a direct military confrontation with Russia, which, as we all understand, could lead to a global conflict. We have repeatedly said that the rabid head of the Kiev clique has nothing to lose, and in his desire to retain power at any cost, he's ready to plunge the entire world into the abyss of nuclear apocalypse. That's his plan B, that he is now trying to present as a victory plan. As is being noted with disappointment by many sensible Western politicians and experts, in Zelenskyy's newly thought-up artless plan, there is no strategic component that would allow NATO and Ukraine to change the course of hostilities in their favor. And that's no surprise, because no such thing exists, and the full defeat of the UAF on the battlefield is only a matter of time. And the head of the Kiev regime is devoid of any military talent anyway, and his Kursk adventure proved that most convincingly. It also demonstrated Zelensky's willingness, without hesitation, to sacrifice Ukraine and the lives of Ukrainians for the sake of Western geopolitical interests that he interprets clearly as dealing a strategic defeat to Russia on the battlefield. At the same time, he is advancing an open and blatant betrayal of the national interests of his own country. The so-called peace plan openly declares a willingness to sell off what's left of Ukraine's natural wealth, which incidentally under Ukraine's constitution would require a referendum, and to use its citizens in future to Europe in the place of American forces. But what is absent from Zelenskyy's latest screenplay is even a hint at a willingness to step on the path of a genuine and long-term peace settlement to the conflict. He remains convinced, as in the case of his previous still-porn initiatives, that the West must, together with him, develop some ultimatum plan and then impose it on Russia. How can such thinking be explained? other than as the regular use of strong narcotics. So it's hard to say. A better formula than the proposals by the Russian hardly something Kiev can hope for anymore. And that opportunity was essentially UAF attack on Kursk Oblast. Hence, the only remaining trump card for the head in Kiev is to provoke a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. The infamous peace plan has this idea embodied first and foremost in the latest demand for Ukraine to join NATO. So that no one has any illusions, I want to immediately reaffirm that Ukraine's membership in NATO in any territorial form in the North Atlantic Alliance for Russia is absolutely unacceptable, and it cannot be part of any peace plans or mediation initiatives. We have developed and are ready to further develop good neighborly relations with a neutral, non-bloc affiliated Ukraine, as was enshrined in its constitution and in our bilateral treaties. However, this provision that is a cornerstone for Ukraine's security was gradually repealed after the US and allies inspired anti-constitutional coup in 2014 that fixed the course on this country, sliding into the mire of crisis, lawlessness, extreme nationalism, and civil war. Madam President, the Council members' very close attention should be paid not to the latest Zelenskyy plan, which, in addition to the elements I've mentioned, contains nothing other than calls for material assistance, but rather should be paid to the statements of the Kiev leader that accompanied his presentation of this opus in Europe. On the 17th of October, the head of the Kiev regime, in particular, as an inveterate blackmailer, declared his intention to create nuclear weapons if his country wasn't taken into NATO. Thus, contemporary Ukraine has essentially publicly declared its intention to violate its obligations under the NPT, the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements of the IAEA, and the additional protocol to it. In other words, we are talking about an open declaration by a non-nuclear state party to the NPT of its intention to violate Article 2 of the treaty, which could lead to an extremely serious international crisis in the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. We are convinced that all members of the Security Council, the entire international community, in fact, must most firmly condemn these irresponsible statements. For the time being, there has been no public reaction to this from the USA and their allies, to this obvious challenge to the non-proliferation regime. This only confirms that they are pandering to any ventures and crimes committed by the Kiev regime. Instead of this, they have become distracted by circulating scaremongering with Iranian, Chinese, and Korean bogeymen, each one of which is more absurd than the one before. This situation around the nuclear blackmail of the illegitimate head of the Kiev regime again convinces us that the decision of the leadership of the Russian Federation at the beginning of the special military operation that was adopted incidentally following similar nuclear threats from the Ukrainian leadership was the only right thing to do. Without the demilitarization, the denazification of Ukraine, and ensuring the human rights and freedoms as applies to all of its citizens, the security threat to our country cannot be eliminated. Madam President, in conclusion, I'd like to touch upon another important subject relating to human rights and civic freedoms in Ukraine. As is well known, our Western colleagues like to present the Kiev regime and its leader as almost a protector of democracy and an example for the entire region. At the same time, the harsh dictatorship that has been established in the country, leading to the delegitimization of the state institutions, thousands of political prisoners, a ban on the Russian language and Russian identity in violation of the country's constitution and the basic norms of international law, and also the hounding of the canonical Orthodox Church, are things that Ukraine's Western backers are trying to ignore. With such selective blindness, the West is hardly going to say anything in relation to the outrageous incident and the trampling of the norms of morality that would be established by any religion, the events that took place in the siege of the St. Michael's Cathedral last week in Cherkasy. We were warned that when Ukraine adopted a law that contradicted the norms of international law and the UN Charter, banning the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, raids on churches and the uses of violence against parishioners would soon follow. And that is what happened. On the 17th of October, Banderites committed another serious crime. More than 100 fighters in camo and balaclavas, forced their way into the cathedral. They opened fire on civilians. They used tear gas, and they forced the parishioners out of the service. On the internet, you can find hundreds of videos of this banditry. And after this, they began looting. They looted the funds. They stole money that was being gathered by the parishioners to restore the cathedral. They took out equipment, icons, church books, and even food. And the police were there, but they didn't intervene in the situation. As a result of the attackers' actions, the prelate of the UOC, Metropolitan Feodosy, received a concussion. The mayor of the city cynically called what happened a voluntary movement of the community under the jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. That is the level of moral degradation that Ukrainian society has achieved, or rather a part of it. We call on the relevant organizations of the UN system to unambiguously condemn the hounding by the Kiev neo-Nazis of Orthodox parishioners, and for the West to end their encouragement of Kiev to commit these barbaric acts. Our Western colleagues need to understand that responsibility for the actions of the regime that they cultivated is also something that they bear, and they will not be able to hide these crimes from their own publics. Thank you.